Chinese going to want global dominance. It's going to happen over time. We just have to figure out how long we can sort of draw that out with barriers.
China is ultimately, I think, what Trump is mainly concerned about. The United States, right, is currently deliberating whether to put in place rules on cybersecurity, right, which would effectively ban any Chinese vehicle from being sold in the US.
Trump administration 2.0 has been threatening tariffs on foreign goods throughout the entire campaign. And now the auto industry here in Germany and beyond is wondering what devils will be in the details. To discuss, we're joined by Gregor Sebastian, a senior analyst at Rhodium Group, and Joe McCabe, president and CEO at Auto Forecast Solutions. So let's start with, what do we know about Trump's tariff plans when it comes to Europe and especially for Germany, Gregor?
So we know that he's made several announcements, right? I think what's clear is that he definitely wants to raise tariffs against Chinese goods and vehicles, but he's also announced a broader suite of tariffs that could literally hit any country in the world, right? He's definitely mentioned German car makers as something that he's opposed to, as long as they're exporting from Germany. And also when you look at his closest allies and advisors, for instance, Lighthizer, who's likely to have a prominent position in either as an advisor or even in the cabinet. He's dedicated a whole chapter in his book on global trade wars to Germany. So Germany is definitely one of those countries that is in his sightline.
And what are the current trade restrictions on foreign cars entering the U.S. right now, Joe?
So we have light tariffs on basically cars, 2.5% across the world. Foreign entity of concerned countries like China, 25%, now 100% under the Biden administration, to be continued under the Trump administration. So there are some levers that the current administration and the future Trump administration are going to pull. From our perspective, the tariffs are going to be bundled in some sort of packaging depending on the audience. If we talk about a tariff that works today for the United States, it's the chicken tax. It's been around for over 60 years, and it helped build the Detroit 3 truck market to what they are now, a 25% tariff on any kind of imported truck. So there are examples how tariffs have worked in a long game to build a domestic economy. However, the downside is that trucks are very expensive, and when you're the only three players in town, and you don't have a lot of competition, then all prices go up on the consumer. So there's always going to be a short-term and long-term pro-con view to the tariff position when it comes to putting on a global perspective.
And you mentioned, Joe, already some of these tariffs that are already in place, but how could these new rounds of Trump tariffs affect the German car industry in your view?
Yeah, so we could look at it sort of compartmentalizing it, right? So I think they're going to be bundled. The one bundle is, let's say you are Europe. The idea here is we want, from a United States perspective, it's about building more product here, controlling the supply base here. So it's a build where you sell mentality. It's always been in the strategy for decades from our perspective. If you build it here, that's fantastic. You're going to build employment. You're going to build, you're going to build an economy. You're going to build an infrastructure around your business. So it's going to be really the push of trying to drive that more into domestic production. I think the bundle from a European perspective is going to be more of a military one, meaning that, Trump's going to want more of Europe to be more backing about what's going on in Israel and Iran and Ukraine and Russia, and using tariffs as almost a threat, going, I have the ability to push these levers against you unless you do these other things for me. I think that's going to be the same thing with China, foreign entity concern issue. That's more of a national perspective. And with Mexico, it's going to be close the border or else. So I think that tariffs aren't going to be the only tool in the toolbox when he goes after it. He's going to bundle them based on the audience he's trying to sort of get leverage on.
You mentioned this bundle, but tariffs, President-elect Trump himself has called it one of his favorite words. But Gregor, could we see this being potentially the start of a trade war or another trade war with China, for example?
I think there's certainly a risk, right? We had the first trade war between the US and China in his first administration, which was basically a tit for tat, where both countries raised tariffs across certain goods, right? It wasn't all goods. There were always some exceptions, for instance, on certain chemicals that the US was not able to get from anywhere else, or certain medical goods. But I think there could be a repeat, right? And I think this time around, what we are hearing from the US administration, there's also a desire to basically prevent Chinese companies in particular from circumventing tariffs. And I think this is part of the reason why the Trump administration is looking into raising tariffs across the board, also in other countries, right? Partly this is to reduce trade surpluses that countries like Germany, Mexico, Japan have, but it's also really about tackling circumvention by some of these car makers, right? And I think this is also why President Trump has been highlighting that, he wants to see investment in the US, right? I think he doesn't want to see it in Mexico or Canada, which are obviously part of the USMCA agreement. He really wants to see it in the United States itself. I think from the German and European perspective, there's really a desire to get a deal before we see the tariffs. I think if the tariffs are implemented, there is going to be a kind of a pushback. I think there's going to be desire to show that Europe is not just a region that you can walk all over, but that you really want to have a counter reaction at that point. So that's also currently why we're seeing signals from the Commission saying, we are keen to buy more gas, more LNG from the US, and perhaps also more military gear.
Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Porsche all saw their shares dip on that Wednesday as the Trump victory became clear. What does this tell us about how the markets are viewing their pictures? Joe, I'll go to you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a disruption coming. Everyone knows how Trump works. If he wants to push on something, he will push on it. And that idea of disruption and uncertainty really causes people to sort of really think their strategy, especially in automotive. Automotive is a glacial speed market. We can't make decisions today that'll affect the market tomorrow. We have suppliers trying to line up their parts today for a vehicle that won't even start production 3 years from today. And that vehicle's been around for 5 years at a minimum. So you're talking about suppliers that are just trying to put plans together around vehicles that will be here 8 years from today in a very volatile political cycle right now. So the sort of, I agree with Gregor. This is the idea. They're looking at their options. The idea is, I think you're going to see a lot more shipments of products in now to the U.S. to sort of build inventory up. You're going to see a lot of, well, you're right. We are Europe. We're a major global player in this space. You need us just like we need you. I think there's going to be some common ground that's going to be hit. But the idea, true, and Gregor hit it. It's the fact that building U.S. jobs. When you look at tariffs on the Chinese are nothing, right? They want market share in the markets they want to get in. They already have a very inexpensive product based on how they're manufacturing their goods. So the idea of slapping a tariff on them is just a speed bump. If you now pile on foreign entity of concerns and national security concerns on top of it, that sort of changes the direction on this. But it was expected if he was going to come out firing with tariffs. Look, we don't believe tariffs are a long-term solution. They always get brought into the consumers paying it, or the importer has to pay it. All costs raise on a tariff perspective. So you have to have a healthy balance. Just going out and penalizing everyone and just slapping the high percentage on them is not the direction. But this idea of this collaborative idea of saying it is a tool that the U.S. can use unless we find some middle ground, or maybe a 51-49 in a U.S. favor from what Trump wants to see. I think where it's going to be a valuable tool from that perspective. But this idea of just all over the map and just slamming 20, 60, 100% on everyone is probably not the right direction, nor the direction I think he's going to take.
I want to come back to some of these German car makers in just a moment, but Joe, you mentioned parts, which is making me wonder, how will tariffs affect U.S. car makers, for example, if they're importing parts, if not every part of their vehicle is made in the USA?
Yeah, it's a big one. Like all BMWs in Spartanburg, all the engines and transmissions are imported from Europe, right? There's a significant amount of powertrains that are coming from Europe on European branded vehicles that are built here. So you're going to see more and more of that push. Now, this idea of going to electrification, which honestly, we never drank the Kool-Aid about everyone's to have a BEV. Electrification is a future. It's not just all BEVs. That's the real idea of how you can move that around. Maybe you can move your battery technology here. Is Volkswagen's putting a significant investment in Canada, for example, for a huge battery footprint up there. You're going to see a lot of motors coming over here as the powertrain shift. But when you look at powertrains, the traditional ones, engines and transmissions, and a lot of them coming from outside of North America for European branded vehicles built here, that is probably the biggest area of concern in terms of how it's going to raise prices.
Cars are a big part of the German economy. Gregor, you're here in Berlin with me. We've been seeing some pretty dire headlines. They can sometimes, the auto industry anyway, be a bit of a canary in the coal mine for the overall health of the German economy. What could U.S. tariffs on German goods mean for the German economy overall when we're already seeing that it's floundering?
Yeah, I mean, Germany's probably hitting its second year of recession now, and a lot of that has to do with our general model of our economy, right? We're very export-oriented. So, and it's not just the US, right? We're seeing this across the world in India, we're seeing it in China, we're now seeing it in the United States, this push for local, right? Having local content requirements, having high tariffs on goods. And obviously, this has implications for the German economy. We're seeing loads of companies, lots of suppliers already at the beginning of the year announcing job cuts. Volkswagen over the summer has announced that it's looking into closing 2 or now 3 of its production sites. And you also mentioned, right, how a stock market's reacting. Well, actually, on the day of the election, BMW had its Q3 earnings out, and they're not looking good, right? For none of the German car makers, the earnings are currently looking particularly good. And this is obviously also a risk, right? They're looking at a rising cost base. They will have to invest in CapEx if they want to continue producing for the US market, very likely, as Joe has been outlining. So it's not really spelling anything good. And I think this has also contributed to the government crisis that has been unfolding over the last week here in Germany.
Well, here in Germany, the IFO Institute for Economic Research came out with a statement following the election of President-elect Donald Trump regarding his tariff plans. The director there, Lissandra Flach, saying, quote, Germany and the EU must now strengthen their position through measures of their own. These include deeper integration of the EU services market and credible retaliatory measures against the US. What can Germany or the European Union do to counter or negotiate when it comes to these proposed tariffs? Is this just this bundle, Joe, that you were talking about?
Yeah, it's going to be a very cloudy direction going forward. I mean, if you look at Europe, a lot of the Detroit 3, other than Stellantis, really isn't a big GM push in there. It's not a Ford push anymore in terms of products being built. They're not high volume anymore. Germany, each country sort of works as almost as an equivalent of a state here with their own Europe, their own regulations here. I think you're going to see Europe really looking at Western Europe, looking also Eastern Europe. You got to find low-cost countries or lower-cost countries to sort of backfill your cost structure. We've been using Mexico and obviously China for that, and that's going to probably be limited going forward with a lot of these actions. But this idea of retaliatory tariffs are definitely in play. And now it's going to be, I think it's going to who blinks first kind of thing. I do believe at the end of the day, there's going to be some middle ground that's going to be determined and agreed upon. There will be a lot of going back and forth in the next several months, 6, maybe 12 months, in terms of how we're going to get to that middle ground. And we're going to have to feel it out on the way. At the end of the day, a lot of it is, we want it. Europe, the United States wants to work with Europe. It's this China impact that everyone's really worried about. And this idea, as Gregor pushed on, this idea, if you tariff everyone, then you can stop them from going into Malaysia or Vietnam to then ship all their parts over here and circumvent any kind of tariff rules. You just put it across the board and no one's safe. But that's not the strategy here. We got to find a way. We're a collaborative environment. There's no way of shutting a border at any one of our markets, whether it's U.S., North America, or Europe. We're highly integrated with each other. We need each other. But you will see this language going back and forth, positions of strength. And I do believe we're going to find some sort of middle ground. But right now, he's not president yet. So it's going to be a lot of interesting news for the next 60 days. And then for the next, I'd say 12 months after that, he's got a lot of things on his plate. He's got borders, and he's got tax issues in the U.S., and he's got geopolitical pains. And, this is just one lever he likes to push. But I think wiser minds will come in and say, look, there's some sort of level playing field we can find that everyone is going to win at the end of the day.
Gregor, this all has me wondering, what could tariffs from the U.S. mean for Europe's relationship with China?
Yeah, I think this is actually a key part of what the Commission, at least, will try to put forward to the U.S. the incoming U.S. administration. Right? They will basically say, look, if you're going hard on us, this also means we have less resource available to collaborate with you on the China threat, right? On the risks emanating from China. So I think this is actually kind of part of the, at least, rhetoric that we will be hearing out of Brussels over the coming weeks and months. That if you put tariffs on us, this is going to undermine not only trust, but it's also going to take away resources that could be spent better elsewhere, right? And I think Joe has also mentioned this in his latest remarks just now, that China is ultimately, I think, what Trump is mainly concerned about. And I think there is still this hope, at least in Brussels and also other European capitals, that there is a deal to be had, right? That Trump, after all, is a pragmatist, right? And that you can actually come to the negotiating table. So I think one thing that we haven't touched upon yet, right? The United States, right, is currently deliberating whether to put in place rules on cybersecurity, right, which would effectively ban any Chinese vehicle from being sold in the US, and also has strong implications for supply chains. I think this is, for instance, something where the European Union might actually show some movement over the coming weeks and months and signal, we're with you on this, right? The United States is not a isolated market, but we're going to create this kind of transatlantic, if not G7 market, which might then eventually bar Chinese vehicles. Whether this is successful, I think nobody knows, but these might at least be some of the signals that we're hearing out of Brussels over the next few months.
Joe, a big struggle that we've been hearing here in Germany is these German automakers, that they've not been able to keep up with China when it comes to EV technology in particular. On the U.S. side, are U.S. car makers keeping up with China, or are these protectionary measures going to help them out a bit more there?
Yeah, so Europe has sort of unfortunately handcuffed themselves. All the big European players have heavy partnerships in China, so they are scaling their tariffs to say, well, we can't hit you with 100% tariff because then you're going to penalize us because we have a significant amount of Volkswagens and BMWs and Mercedes already co-mingled within the Chinese economy. We all picked this direction for a low-cost access to 1 billion consumers, and we should have seen the writing on the wall that eventually it was going to come back and basically be fed right back to this. The Chinese have been borrowing our technology for the last 3 decades, and now they're going to sell it back to us. The Chinese want energy independence and global dominance. They don't want to buy anyone, want to subsidize any oil anymore, so they want to make their own coal-fired dirty electricity to satisfy their electrified strategy. They have phenomenal quality products. BYD is going to be a force to be reckoned with in China. They are already doing well, or a little bit well, but breaking it into Europe. They're going to come to Mexico and sort of plant their flag in Mexico and sell themselves to a Mexican consumer and saying, don't worry, U.S., we're not coming north. We know that's not true. Eventually they will. So when you could talk about a $15,000 BYD and someone slaps 100% tariff on it, now it's 30, it's still the cheapest electric vehicle on the market, and it's very, very high quality. This idea, though, is that we're finally seeing that pendulum swing back. The government's put too much emphasis on electrification as the only solution. That was a mistake. BEVs are one product in a balanced portfolio. Plug-in hybrids, extended range, and ICE are very important products. But governments really support us. Environmentalists really got behind us and forced the issue. And now we're seeing a lot of manufacturers way too much capacity. It's the reason why Volkswagen, in over nearly 90 years, is doing its first plant shutdown threat, because they put way too much capacity around a product that consumers are not consuming. Now, if you force a consumer to go down electrification path and you're forced to say, I have to buy one, then I can either buy a $50,000 European branded one or a $30,000 high quality Chinese. Well, if all I have to do is satisfy the acquisition of the product and not be forced to buy my local brand, well, I'm going to consider that Chinese product as a very viable solution to my problem. And that's what happened with this electrification strategy. We opened up the doors to these new players, and they said, we just want market share. Profitability, that'll come next someday. But market share, that's what we need, and that's where we're going to get it. So that's where we're really trying to back up and say, wait a second, we got to keep the Chinese out. Chinese going to want global dominance. It's going to happen. It's going to happen over time. We just have to figure out how long we can sort of draw that out with barriers, whether they're tariffs, whether they're foreign entity of concern issues, whether they are cybersecurity bans. There's a lot of little things we're trying to do to really keep the Chinese at bay.
Gregor, should we be thinking about these potential tariffs as meaning that the U.S. marketplace is shrinking for German cars or the German auto industry? And if so, what does that mean for the long-suffering German EV sector?
Well, I think you can look at it through two lenses, right? I think it's not closing for the companies itself, right? I think, once again, if you are committed to the US market, and I think a lot of German companies, we're not just talking about the OEMs, but we're also talking about suppliers like Bosch, Continental, that have roots in North America and the United States, they can benefit. I think the issue perhaps, and this is once again maybe putting on the Trump glasses here, right? The kind of national economic lenses, that less value added and less employment will be generated through US consumers in Germany, right? And from a US perspective, this is great, right? Because it basically means that more of that value added, more of that employment is going to be generated in the United States. But for an already flailing German economy, right, that is already suffering job losses in the automotive sector, this is ultimately not good news.
I'll ask both of you this question, but we'll start with you, Joe. Ultimately, this has me wondering, how realistic are these between 10 and 20% tariffs on goods going into the world's largest economy? Clearly, it's kicking up some dander here in Europe and Germany already, but should we be thinking of this as a real threat or just a point to start the negotiations?
I think it should be considered a short-term threat, but also the point of negotiations. I think it's the idea that it says, look, this is what I want to do. Now you, Europe and Germany specifically, have to come back with a solution that's going to make it beneficial for me, the United States, let's say, to take them away. And I think those will happen. But, Trump is not a guy throws a threat out and then decides, don't worry about it, I'm going to pull it back. He acts on it until someone pushes back and says, okay, I have a way to make us both happy. Look, when it comes to European brands, they have a lot of brand loyalty in the United States. BMW, Volkswagen, Mercedes, these are high value products. They're highly, they've pretty high brand loyalty when it comes to here. I don't think it's the demise of the European brands in North America. I think it does need a scrutiny on their powertrain mix and how they're strategizing it. I still blame a lot of it on the too aggressive push into electrification space, which is really what's pulling this thing back. If we stayed in the balanced portfolio space, I think we'd be telling a different story when it comes to the success of the European brands. And unfortunately, it was a governmental push that did this. It wasn't the consumer pushing it. Again, I keep coming back to that. So that's an important distinction here. It's not that they have a poor product or other people are better quality than that. It's just a misbalance of it across the world when it came to this electrification strategy. So I think there's going to be some disruption. There's going to be a lot of what do we do next, because this is a long industry and we got to plan now for, again, 3, 4, 8 years from today on how this all plays out. So there is a risk in the front end of this saying, here it comes, until we dial it back with some sort of answers that the U.S. believes is beneficial.
And Gregor, briefly, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I think to be honest, after all, the Trump administration is going to look at this transactionally, right? I think there is a real threat that the tariffs could be implemented. But I think they're also looking what's in it for them, right? And if the Commission, if Berlin can offer something in return, there might still be the possibility of a deal. I think from Europe's perspective, it's the question of how much are you willing to give, right? You're obviously concerned about being embroiled in a trade war, not just with the US, right? There's also the fact that the Commission has recently put duties on Chinese EVs, and China has already signaled its willingness to retaliate against Europe. So there is really this concern to be trapped between two sides, and Europe coming out at the bottom here. But there's also the concern that you can't concede too much to the US either, right? We've already hearing now some other remarks from coming Vice President J.D. Vance that if the European Union goes hard against Platform X, using the Digital Services Act, to fine US tech companies, that this could also have security implications for the transatlantic relationship. And I think this is maybe where the next US administration could push the Europeans a bit too far.
Gentlemen, lots to discuss, but we'll have to leave it there. Gregor, Sebastian, a senior analyst at Rhodium Group, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And Joe McCabe, president and CEO at Auto Forecast Solutions. Joe, thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.